So the big Eldar rules preview is out, and it looks like it could be one of the very strongest faction focuses so far. Seems that 40K's tricksy space elves have stolen the Sister of Battle Miracle Dice mechanic and have it in a very powerful way as well. Plus their detachment rule gives them a seriously nice damage boost to every single unit shooting and fighting. The damage output from Eldar armies is going to be brutal. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking Eldar, and I thought we'd go through the faction rules that Games Workshop have just revealed for them, and I must admit they seem to be looking very strong and easily usable by a bunch of units. Talking through the reveals, perhaps one of the most interesting things is how the base stats of a bunch of the armies change. While several factions in 40k have perhaps had somewhat unexpected reduces in either their hit rolls or their leadership, the Eldar have come through this okay. It seems that they're a leadership 6+ army, so that's better than many now, and they still hit on 3+ across the board, even for Guardians, a unit that switched between 3+ and 4+ in the past. Shuriken weapons maybe aren't super exciting. In 9th edition they had that rule where they got a bunch of extra AP on 6s to wound, but that does seem like it's just been removed. On the other hand though, all of them get at least AP -1 even on the lightest of their attacks, and that really does seem to be fairly uncommon on small arms in 10th edition now. I feel like they're still going to be a general purpose threat when delivered in large quantities. Battle focus does appear to be completely gone. It's neither the core rule nor the detachment rule. I guess it's not impossible that we might see it in a different detachment though. Looks like at least the entire army won't be move shoot moving, though we still have access to fire and fade, so you can still put down the Eldar signature move on one unit per turn should you want to. I'd guess that at least a fair few weapons might gain the assault keyword. That does seem to allow you to just move and shoot without any penalty now. Looks like the Shuriken catapults and the Shuriken pistols get that, so I guess that means that Guardian defenders and things will be able to move quite quickly while laying down their signature firepower. Getting into their primary faction rules though, Strands of Fate looks very exciting now. It's been reworked a bit and we'll go over the details in just a second, but it's basically 12d6 miracle dice from the start of the game, and there are ways to both generate more and manipulate the rolls. On the first take it doesn't really seem any weaker than the Sisters of Battle, and it looks like you're going to be able to front load all those miracle dice equivalents into the first few battle rounds, which does seem very nice to me. I'd say perhaps the less exciting rule, but perhaps no less powerful, is the Battle Host standard one. That one's Unparalleled Foresight, and it's basically a flat damage boost to rerolls whenever you attack, kind of similar to the old Master Artisans, and it does seem absolutely brutal on big anti-tank weapons and things. Then for the rest of the previews, it seems that we've got more rules for the Fire Prism's main gun, which can twin link in a particularly helpful way now. Fire and Fade remains, although it is a pricey option, but a price worth paying quite a bit of the time if it's going to save a unit from death. And then for datasheet previews, we've got a couple of rather helpful ones, the Farseer and Guardian Defenders. I think that's two really good ones to choose to understand what's going on with the army. Loads to talk about here, so let's just jump straight into it. First up, we've got the Strands of Fate rework, and I feel like Eldar players will probably be quite happy with this. The previous rule for this in 9th edition was maybe a little bit more complex than this. At the start of each battle round, you roll a set of d6s. Each of the numbers corresponds into a different result that you could sub in 6s for over the course of the turn, and you had to retain a couple of them, the rolls that you thought would be most valuable for plugging in those 6s. I did think it was really quite an evocative mechanic once they revealed it with the 9th edition codex. Basically you play as a Farseer casting the runes of fate and selecting the optimal things for guiding their army to victory. In 10th edition, the mechanic's been reworked a little bit, though I'd still say that it keeps the same sort of flavour of rules, but now works a lot more akin to Sisters of Battle Miracle dice. You roll 12d6 at the start of the battle, and ideally you want to be trying to roll high numbers, so you've got some big numbers to substitute into important rolls, and then broadly speaking that's going to be your main dice pool for the whole of the game. Interestingly, there is a bit of a defence against the mechanic just giving you a poor roll from the outset. Say if you rolled absolutely nothing but 1s and 2s on the first big roll, you do have the option just to flat re-roll all of them. If you're not happy with the result at the start of the battle, you can choose to basically bin off one of the dice and then re-roll the other 11. Means that you'll have less dice overall, but if you roll particularly badly, that's probably going to be a good move. You can do that repeatedly if desired, but if you just keep on doing it, you're going to wind up with less and less dice. Though I feel like it perhaps is going to be a reasonable decision to re-roll once or twice and keep up with 10 or 11 good ones. From there, basically these dice function very similarly to Sisters of Battle Miracle dice, the faction preview that we had not so very long ago. Basically when you make one of the rolls specified, so that's advance, battle shock, charges, damage, hit roll, save throw and wound rolls, You then get to select one of your fate dice and plug it into the roll before you roll if you wish to. So say if you wanted a big damage roll, you could take a 5 or 6 and just choose to take that one rather than rolling say a d6 damage for a Bright Lance. As I'm sure people who have played Sisters will realise, it's a very powerful mechanic. Things like 6s will be absolutely great for damage rolls or big charge rolls if you're going to have to go a long way. It seems also very nice for things like devastating wounds or maybe even lethal hits, if the Eldar can get that. I feel like devastating wounds is probably going to be a thing on D-cannons and things, and plugging in an auto 6 could be absolutely brutal for that. Things like 3s to 5s are really quite handy as well, very nice for hit and wound rolls, for big hit weapons like fire prisms or bright lances again. And there's all sorts of opportunistic uses that you could use if you desperately need to pass battle shock, or if you need a big advanced roll to get onto an objective, plugging in the results reliably is great. Overall, my initial reaction to this is that it seems very powerful, probably more powerful than the Strands of Fate rule was before. I'm kind of surprised that Games Workshop allows you to roll all 12d6 at the start of the game, potentially really allowing you to front load your big dice rolls and gain some pretty critical advantages in the first couple of turns. From this base rule, you won't be generating any more over the course of the game, so I guess it will have some diminishing returns, but realistically we need to see all the datasheets and things until we know how many ways there are to generate them. Currently, just from the two that they're previewed, Farseers are allowed to manipulate a dice, so say if you had a roll of a 1 and you used a Strand of Fate roll within a unit that's within 12 inches of a Farseer, you could substitute that 1 for a 6. Really big, and it means that a Farseer could be making a great use of some of the worst rolls out of your selection. It also appears that Guardians on objectives will generate you more of these, really quite a big draw to having some in your army, as Games Workshop seems to like including for their troops. Each objective marker with a Guardian squad on at the end of your command phase will generate you another one. Seems almost auto-include to have a squad of Guardians on your home objective at the very least. Overall though, I think that this has got a lot of potential. A few key rolls going your way seems great, and having a Farseer next to your most important units seems excellent for that manipulation. Next up we have the detachment rule, and I feel like this one's going to get less press than the first one. But genuinely in terms of utility and raw damage output added to your army, I feel like this might actually be the stronger rule of the two. This one's the Eldar detachment rule for their battle host. It's called Unparalleled Foresight, and simply put, it's basically the old version of Master Artisans or Expert Crafters. Literally every single time your unit either shoots or fights, you get to reroll one hit roll and one wound roll. I feel like just from the rule itself, it's easy to underestimate just how good that is. But say for example, if you had just 10 units over your army, either shooting or fighting in one turn, you basically got yourself 20 rerolls there. Really not bad at all, considering that command point rerolls can be valuable in their own way. Just from the outset, this looks like it's going to be a really big damage boost, to the extent where I think it's going to be kind of strange for them trying to balance this with other Eldar detachments. The other detachment rules would have to be pretty massive to outweigh this kind of damage. As with this rule in editions past, it's a really big draw to running loads and loads of small squads or vehicles, and particularly ones with small numbers of high power shots where these rerolls have the highest effect. Say for example we had an Eldar Viper with a Bright Lance hitting and wounding its target on a 3+, being able to essentially fully reroll the hit roll and the wound roll averages you a 77% damage buff on that kind of unit with the Bright Lance. Not really far off being twice as good as a single Bright Lance would be without this. I feel like Eldar armies are going to want to spam lots of small units like that. Perhaps individual war walkers could be another good target, or small squads of support weapons. The amount of rerolls that you could have on very high power shots does seem pretty insane. Doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be broken or unbalanced in any way. It might be that Games Workshop's just going for putting a lot of Eldar power into the detachments and the army special rules, and it means that their datasheets will be costed more as a result. But still, in terms of raw strength of faction preview rules, this seems like it's far ahead of many of the other armies that we've seen. I do find it kind of hilarious as well that Games Workshop said that rerolls would be kind of rare and limited to certain units, and never mind the rest of the previews, but now we've got an army that literally rerolls a dice literally every time they shoot or fight. Very strong. This one is super easy to use and a great detachment rule, I think. Next up, we've got a couple of other rules previews. First up, Fire and Phase, the signature Eldar frustration move of moving, shooting, and then hiding again behind terrain. This one does still cost 2 CP, so it's a fairly painfully expensive stratagem in 10th edition when you start on 0 CP. How accessible this is might well depend on what mechanics Eldar have for command point manipulation. We've seen things with the Space Marine Captain allowing some free stratagems, and there'll probably be some sort of options to allow you to regenerate them a bit, and I think that'll determine just how painful this one is to spend. Seems that in this incarnation of Fire and Fade you can target most units. The only things that you can't go for are aircraft or units within engagement range. Seems like you're fine to target things like Wraith units or super heavies or whatever. It is quite unrestricted besides that. Basically, this one lets you make a normal move after your shooting phase, no advancing or anything like that, but still can be pretty decent given good Eldar movement values. Perhaps the most typical way to use it would be to have a unit that's in front of line of sight blocking terrain, have them gun down a bunch of enemies, and then step behind the line of sight blocking terrain so the enemies can't catch up with them next turn. Definitely frustrating, but still very Eldar. They do like to keep the enemy away from them. Fire and Fade, though, is often just used as a flat out movement boost. It does mean that with a fast jet bike or something, you could cross about half the board in one turn. Can be pretty handy for slow units as well. Say, for example, you had a Wraith Knight that you just wanted to throw as far up the board as you possibly could. You could use this to then move and then shoot, and then get them very close to the enemy, even if they can't charge next turn. Overall, still seems very good, a lot more of a painful investment with 2 CP in 10th, and it has also picked up a rule which means that you can't get into transports with that normal move. That was something that they previously had with Dart Reapers, where Eldar players would have the Dart Reapers fire at an enemy and then fall back into a transport so they couldn't be shot. Still though, it looks like a great tool to have access to, though it is costly. Next up, we've got the trusty firepower of the Fire Prism. It's still got its focus mode and dispersed mode as per previously, though I'd say the biggest change to this one is to linked fire, previously a stratagem, but now it just appears to be a rule baked into the datasheet for the focus profile of the Fire Prism, and it looks really quite handy. The way that linked fire works now is that basically if you've got multiple fire prisms in your army, then you can use linked fire to fire the focus profile of the lance, and you get to measure range and line of sight from another friendly fire prism that this model can see. Kind of similar to previously, I feel like this is going to be absolutely great for, say, having 3 fire prisms in the backfield, keep 2 of them hidden, nose one around the edge of terrain to some important targets, and then all 3 fire prisms can fire out of the one that can see, handing out their massive damage output to the heavy hitter while remaining safe. The one that's exposed could try and just limit its positioning so it can only see its target, and most other enemy units might struggle to get line of sight on it, or potentially I guess it might even be able to fire and phase. That way you've just dealt out the firepower of 3 fire prisms, and then you've kept them all hidden for the next turn. Certainly not a particularly nice thing to play against when they're efficient, and I can't help but think that those focus mode profiles are going to be really good with those single rerolls. For the actual stats themselves, Games Workshop have wiggled some numbers around a little bit, but broadly they've just got a similar sort of feel to the 9th edition stats. The Focus Lancers still get 2 shots at strength 18, AP -4 and damage 6. Damage 6 I guess being a little bit more reliable than 3d3, and the others feel like small side grades that aren't too important. Strength 14 versus Strength 18 still means that you're wounding just about everything on 3s or better, and AP4 versus AP5 isn't the biggest deal in the world. Dispersed mode lost a pip of AP and became a bit more swingy with 2d6 shots, but still it'll be good for if there's no heavy targets in your enemy's army. Finally, we've got a couple of profiles for 2 very handy units to see, I think. First up, the Eldar Farseer, certainly an absolute linchpin model in the current Eldar Codex. I think everyone knew that these guys will be losing a fair bit of flexibility, now you can no longer select powers, but from these rules previews still looks like they do 3 interesting things with their psychic abilities, and particularly with the Strands of Fate manipulation, I feel like you'd at least want 1 in your army at the very least. Profile wise, there may be nothing enormously exciting, 4 wounds and a 4+ invul save, a couple of attacks in combat with their witch weapons, though it does seem that the strength of those have been greatly decreased. They're only strength 3 now, though the Witchblade does pick up anti-infantry 2+. I think the selling point of the Farseers are definitely their special rules. Branching Fates looks great, that's the one for manipulating Strands of Fate dice, so if you select one unit within 12 inches of a Farseer to do a Strands of Fate substitution in, even if you select a really low dice, then that dice automatically becomes a 6. 6s are going to be super valuable, as mentioned earlier. It means that you could bin off a terrible Strands of Fate roll and get a 6 into a damage output, say a Bright Lance doing 6+2 damage for a big 8. Looks like this is one of the rules that's only limited to once per army per turn, so I guess that's a small disincentive to spam multiple Farseers. Next up, their second buffing rule does look very nice. The next one is Fortune, it would seem, and this one casts on a 2+ now, with no chance of perils or anything like that, and this one's a nice simple damage debuff with a -1 to wound on the target that you cast it on. Doesn't look like there's any sort of requirements to what you can target, looks like you could put this on something like a Wraith Knight if you really wanted to, and I feel like in general that's going to be really quite handy. Eldar are an army that's famed for low durability, so having an easy access to something that's going to massively amp that up is great. I feel like between this and some of the tougher things that Eldar can field, you could have a unit that's genuinely hard to remove from an objective now, something that Eldar just haven't really had a fat lot of in 9th edition. Otherwise on their profile they get a few shooting attacks. Eldritch Storm seems like it's a decent enough shooting shot. D6 attacks with Blast, hitting on a 3+, Strength 6 AP -2 and damage D3. Looks like that'll be a fairly reasonable Space Marine killer, Not going to be doing too much against vehicles, but definitely handy to have in the unit. Otherwise, it looks like if you choose to equip them with a singing spear, then you get a single shot at strength 9, damage 3 with no AP, trading off against actually having some okay anti-infantry wound rolls in the fight phase against the Witchblade. Overall, from this, I feel like Farseers are definitely less flexible, but I think they'll still get played for certain. A -1 to wound handout is great, and so is the Strands of Fate manipulation. Those two mechanics should be enough to justify them, and then throwing down an Eldritch Storm is just a little bit of added value. Finally, last but not least, we have the Guardian Defenders, another handy unit to see I think, as it previews a whole bunch of special weapons, plus also their shuriken shots. Their base profile seems to have made the transition from 9th to 10th in some pretty good shape to be honest, compared with a lot of units. Even your basic Guardian foot soldiers get a leadership of 6+, which is nice for 40k now. They get to hit on 3+, both at range and in melee. In the past, Guardians have often only hit on 4s, as they're less trained than the Aspect Warriors I suppose, so they've lucked out in retaining the 3+ hit roll. And they've also managed to retain a 4+ save for their Eldar mesh armor, kind of surprising in a way, given that the Skitarii that we saw the other day don't seem to have got a 4+ save themselves. Overall, fairly nice. The 4+ save I think is really quite meaningful in 10th edition with so many anti-infantry guns not having much AP now. Otherwise, as mentioned earlier, these guys can generate you some Strands of Fate dice. If you have them on objectives in the command phase, you get to make one other Strands of Fate roll and then add that to your current pool. Not sure if there'll be other ways to generate dice like this might genuinely be the only way, and certainly if there aren't other easy ways, then at least one unit of Guardians seems auto-include at least for your home objective, and it might well be worth having more to try and take some on the midfield. Those Strands of Fate rolls are going to have some massive value. For midfield ones, I guess it would still be a bit questionable as to whether or not they can survive on the front line versus the enemy with only toughness 3. That might be a bit more of a question. Finally, we've got their weapon profiles, and as mentioned earlier, I think that the shuriken weapons are still okay. No more big extra AP on 6s, but retaining AP -1 in 10th edition really isn't bad for small arms. We have seen a fair amount of other lighter guns go down to AP 0. There are assault weapons as well, and that looks like that's got no sort of debuff to your hit roll in 10th, although admittedly they didn't have that anyway with battle focus in 9th. Otherwise, it's kind of fun to see the list of different heavy weapons that you can get here. They get to put those on the heavy weapon platform, which now has the same stat line as most of the rest of the Guardian Defenders, a save of 4+ and a toughness of 3, perhaps designed so you can't weirdly tank lighter shots on the platform before it kills regular Guardians. The Bright Lance looks expectedly solid anti-tank. It's basically got the las cannon profile at 36 inches, strength 12, AP -3, but its damage is d6+2, so it's better than las cannons in that way. Still looks pretty brutal anti-armor there. At least on paper that average damage is better than it was in 9th edition, an average of 5.5 wounds on vehicles compared with 5. Otherwise the scatter laser is 6 shots, all at strength 5, AP 0, damage 1. The shuriken cannon is 3 shots at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 1, no heavy keyword or anything like that, and it seems like the previous previewed version of that had indeed picked up ignores cover just from the Dark Reaper datasheet. It doesn't look like they ignore cover innately. The missile launcher is pretty much as I'd expect, a tiny bit more AP on the Sunburst mode, at least compared with the Imperial equivalent, going to be good against light vehicles but not so great against heavy on the Starshot mode, and it seems that the new version of the Star Cannon is strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2, still going to be fairly general purpose, though in general it's going to be wounding the vast majority of vehicles on 5s now. I feel like these heavy weapons in general will be pretty excellent just being a focal point for those big rerolls that we talked about earlier. A single Bright Lance is going to be incredibly reliable at converting that wound roll, and then you can maybe even plug in a Strands of Fate dice if the opponent does fail the save for a massive damage 8. That sort of thing seems like it's just something that you can barely ignore, even if it's just a one-off heavy weapon in a Guardian unit. Let me know what you make of these Eldar previews though. I feel like just from these rules previewed alone, the Eldar are looking very strong going into 10th, and this looks like one of the best news faction previews that we've seen so far for them. Obviously no way of telling whether or not they are going to be top dogs in the game without points costs, could be that Games Workshop have just pointed them correctly, but with two incredibly reliable ways to produce a whole bunch of damage, I feel like their core rule and detachment rule are looking truly excellent. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones each day, and I'll definitely be covering the other faction previews. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you're interested in helping support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.